Hello, everyone. In this video, we're going to talk about stocks, mortgages, and other types of securities. We've talked about bonds before, but in addition to issuing debt through bonds, firms can also sell part of their ownership to raise capital. And stocks represent ownership shares in a firm. Keep in mind, shareholders do have some influence in the operations of a firm, but this is really determined by the level of ownership that they have. Firms might prefer to sell a part of their ownership because they can sell shares and then move forward without that burden of debt because they won't have to pay back those bonds or other types of debt in the future. When we think about stocks, think about Apple. Apple sells shares of stock, but if I own one share of stock, do I really have a lot of influence over the operations of Apple as a corporation? And hopefully the answer that you're thinking is absolutely not. And the reason why is that Apple has literally millions of shares of stock currently outstanding. So if I only own one share of Apple stock, my ownership percentage is very low. While I am entitled to a vote, my vote doesn't actually count for very much, but it is a way that companies like Apple can go ahead and raise capital without having to worry about paying it back in the future. Now, here's a good practice what you know. What is an advantage of a firm selling stock instead of selling bonds? And the answer here is that stocks don't burden that firm with future debts that must be paid, because rather than owing money to whoever invests, they actually now have taken on a burden of that company by becoming a part owner, and they will not be reimbursed for what they've paid. The next thing that I want to show you is secondary markets. So these are markets in which securities are traded after their first sell. And this is important because it allows firms to sell bonds at higher prices or lower interest rate because demand for assets increases if they hold enough value to be resold. When we talk about secondary markets, this is stock markets, so things like the New York Stock Exchange and the NASDAQ, or National Association of Securities Dealers Automated Quotations. So that's a mouthful, but you'll usually just hear it referred to as NASDAQ. And this is just a secondary market where securities are able to be sold, maybe not necessarily directly from the firm whose name is on that security. These are very important institutions because they foster both direct and indirect investment. And it allows us to essentially sell those bonds at higher prices or lower interest rates as our company's credibility increases. Now, when we talk about secondary markets making securities more value, I want to show you kind of graphically what that looks like. So we have our supply of securities, and then we have our original demand. This is whenever they're going from the firm directly to whoever is purchasing those securities. Now, if those securities are thought to be worth selling again, meaning they still have value to pass to somebody else, the demand is going to shift or jump to the right, meaning that overall demand is increasing, and the overall quantity and price are both going to increase. So secondary markets make securities more valuable. Let's do another practice what you know. Why is a secondary market for securities important? Well, again, as if I have not driven this home enough for you, it increases the value of securities. Moving right along, we want to take a look at Treasury securities. So these are bonds sold by the US government to pay for national debt. And the interest rate is determined by auction, so it's a little bit different. These are typically considered to be very low in risk because the government does always pay their debts back. And it's a very active secondary market. Nobody really expects the United States to default, so these securities are typically considered to be not very risky at all. These securities are very important in macroeconomics and finance, so you'll definitely hear more about these later on in chapters 17 and 18. Now, this slide shows a list of some major US Treasury security holders back in 2017. And you can see that it's places like China, Japan, Ireland, Brazil, the Cayman Islands, and so on. So it's not necessarily just locally or domestically that people are buying these securities. Politically, it happens all over the world where people are interested in purchasing those US securities because they do have a low default risk. Now, it says of the 20 trillion of US government debt in 2017, Foreigners held approximately what percentage? And if we add that all up, in this case, China specifically held about 7% of the total US debt. The total debt in 2017 was about 18 trillion. So if you wanted to, do a little bit of research here, these numbers are shown in billions, and you could answer this question on your own to figure out what percentage of the US debt was owned by outside countries. Now, mortgages are something that a lot of students are a lot more familiar with than they are with some of the other concepts that we talk about in these chapters. But mortgages are just loans that individuals use to pay for homes, and they become an increasingly important tool as more and more people are interested in buying homes. Most people can't afford to purchase a home with cash, so people have to take out these loans to buy homes, and those are mortgages. The most common mortgage is about 30 years from inception and is paid off with 360 monthly payments over that course of 30 years. Each month, the homeowner is paying back part of the principal or the original amount borrowed plus some interest. And historically, fixed rate mortgages are the most popular type of home loan, meaning that interest rate won't change over time. Now, mortgage patterns did change up during the early 2000s, which did lead to the 2008 recession. But you can think of mortgages as a variation on bonds. If a family wants to buy a home, they take out a mortgage loan, and this is really the same as a firm selling a bond to the public. This graph shows the US home mortgage market from 1990 to 2018, and you can see the highlighted area is when we had that recession in 2008. So in 1982, there was about $2.2 trillion in home mortgages in the US, but by 2008, this was over 11 trillion, so a pretty huge increase. And then during and after the recession, the mortgage market began to fall pretty sharply because people were not able to borrow to buy those homes. Securitization is another thing that is important to mention in this chapter, and this is just the creation of a new security by combining some otherwise separate loan agreements. And this is a really good example of kind of what went wrong in 2008. So mortgage-backed securities are just combos or bundles of mortgages, and it benefits borrowers because interest rates are lowered, which increases the overall investment opportunity, and it helps lenders because it allows them to kind of buy into new opportunities without really getting very detailed. It is important to understand what kind of bundle you're buying if you were to purchase some of these securitized or securitization bundles. And in the past, junky mortgages were basically combined and then sold as if they were very, lucrative investment opportunities when that wasn't necessarily the case. So what a security bundle might look like here is we have a bunch of different mortgages from different families that are all bundled into one big security that's worth $1 million. So rather than having these 5 separate securities, we would just have one larger security. This is very popular, but again, you do need to make sure that you understand what's going into that bundle so you don't end up with a bad investment. Now, this is a very brief overview into all these different types of securities, but we will talk more about these later on in the semester. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. Otherwise, I'll talk with you in the next one. Thank you.